Kia ora, everyone. Got a few more people just joining us, so we'll give it one more minute. Kia ora koutou katoa, ko Austin toku ingoa. Welcome, everyone. My name is Austin. Thank you so much for joining us today. Just please note that today's session is being recorded and we will share this with you afterwards. So today we're focused on giving you the basics you need to get started with climate action. I'm going to start big, looking at climate change, some of the key market and regulations that might be driving the conversation that you're hearing. We'll cover some key vocabulary and concepts behind carbon accounting. We'll do a shift to what you can do about those impacts. And we do have time at the end for questions. So please feel free to use the Q&A box as we go, drop those in and we'll address the questions at the end. We'll also be leaving you with some ideas for next steps and some resources for where you go from here. So to set the scene, first a little bit about us. Like I said, my name is Austin. I'm a product manager at Toitu EnviroCare. And Toitu is a subsidiary of Manaki Whenua, a New Zealand government-owned research institute. We really hold fast to those roots in science. For the past 20 years, we've applied science to enable organizations to take credible climate and environmental action. We are a business, but we're a purpose-driven business. Our mission is all about catalyzing action for a zero carbon future. That's our goal. And everything we do is aimed at how we can achieve that impact. So far, we've helped hundreds of companies around the world measure over 200 million tons of emissions. And those same companies have been working on reducing those. At last count, they've got about 8.4 million tons reduced and counting. I'll talk a little bit more about those specific carbon services that we provide that are enabling that action in a few minutes. But first, I want to set the scene for you. We're going to start with climate trends, specifically starting with the trends that we actually see in the climate, in the atmosphere itself. So the world has warmed 1.2 degrees so far compared to pre-industrial levels, sort of when we started monitoring the levels that we link to climate change and global warming. And those temperatures are on the rise. You can see there's that bit of fluctuation there, but it's a steady upward trend. And if we stay on this pathway, we'll probably hit about 1.5 degrees of warming in roughly 10 years. You might have heard that number, 1.5 degrees. It's the goal under the Paris Agreement. There might be catchy phrases, keep 1.5 alive. Hundreds of companies are pledging to limit warming to 1.5. Nations are pledging their commitments, but doing their fair share to hit 1.5. But what does 1.5 actually mean? Why do we care? At home, if you adjust your heat pump sort of up or down 1.5 degrees, it's not a big difference, right? You may not even need to sort of add or remove a jersey. It's not a big deal. But when you step back and you're looking at the global atmosphere, thinking about that degree, 1.5 degrees at the global level, it's actually really, really impactful. Even a half a degree, when we're talking about the global atmosphere, can have devastating impacts, a huge amount of change. So these charts here, they show you sort of just the difference between 1.5 and 2 degrees. So half a degree there. Those effects, they don't just get a little bit worse. The extremes are getting so much more extreme, so much more frequent. And this actually continues to get worse as you creep over that 2 degrees. Some of the resources that we'll share at the end, if this is really interesting to you, are some really good accessible places to dive deeper and start to get a feel for what the world might look and feel like at 1.5 degrees, at 2 degrees, at 3 degrees, and why it's so important that we aim to limit this as much as possible to 1.5. Now, I said we're already at about 1.2. So we're already feeling a lot of these effects. These things are already baked in. Things like sea level rise, extreme floods, droughts, storms, fires, warmer seas, things that you're seeing in the news already quite frequently, and they're only going to get worse. Now, when it comes to climate science, some of the stuff I'm talking about, one of our best sources is the IPCC. So this is the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. It's a United Nations body for assessing the science that's related to climate change. So this group, they look at all the scientific research, these findings that are coming out, they analyze all of it, they pull it together into these amazing reports that are really our best source of what's happening in our climate and where is it likely to go next? Where are we going? The latest report came out in March and it delivered news we'd been expecting. This is a code red for humanity. It's an urgent crisis. It's devastating news. Based on all the projections, all of the different models, all of the different potential futures here, we have 800 days left to stop increasing emissions. So the emissions that we're putting out into the atmosphere, they can't get any bigger from 2025. From 2025 onward, they can only go down. And that's if we're to have any chance of success at limiting warming to that 1.5 degrees and to have the best possible chance at being able to adapt to the impacts. So we're already at 1.2. A lot of those impacts are already guaranteed. They're already happening and baked in. And we and nature need to be able to adapt to those things. So the best chance is to go fast and hard and quick. Now, everyone's in agreement on this, right? And so at the national level, we have things like here in New Zealand, the Climate Change Response, the Zero Carbon Amendment Act from 2019, that provides the sort of the legal framework by which in New Zealand we can develop and implement clear and stable climate change policies so that we can both contribute to this global effort to limit the global temperature increase to 1.5 degrees, but also allow New Zealand to prepare for and adapt to those effects of climate change that we know we're going to have. Now, current policies, so policies just like that and policies around the world, if we look at all the ones that are already in place, that's putting us here at that sort of that orange middle bar there. Current policies are going to take us to probably around 2.5, 3 degrees of warming. When you take, you sort of add in some of the pledges and targets that maybe aren't fully implemented into policy yet, but they're there. If we assume all of those things happen, we're still looking at about 2 degrees of warming. That bottom green line there, that's the 1.5 degree pathway. And what you should notice about this is how sharp it drops so quickly compared to those other ones. This is what's so critical for us. We basically need to have half of the emissions that we currently have, half of them by 2030. And as you're getting to 2050, it's really as close to zero as possible. The faster and sharper those emissions, that curve bends, the more likely we are to have the best possible result here, both in terms of our climate and the impacts that we're going to feel. It is possible. The IPCC report, the one that came out sort of telling us this is code red, it also told us we've got everything we need. We can do this. It's just about taking action now and going fast and with urgent action. Now, that's at the national level. This is, the global level. This is true in our individual lives as well. So Kantar in New Zealand, they've sort of done this survey for years now. How concerned are you or not about various things? And with climate change, apart from that blip you can see with 2020 when we were all a little bit focused on the COVID pandemic, there's an increasing trend there and it's likely to continue to increase. We all are very concerned about climate change and it keeps increasing. That's translating through to behavior change. So looking at, in your individual life as a consumer, looking for carbon claims on products or services that you're thinking about, making efforts. How can you do something? What can you do at home? What choices can you make? What lifestyle changes maybe are you making? Simple as switching to a different brand that's more sustainable. These are things that, increasingly the majority is, we're seeing these things happen. And at the business level, this is absolutely true as well. This is a great stat. We'll send this through so you can kind of read through these afterwards, but 90% of executives believe that sustainability is important. The trick is that you only see about 60% of companies with a strategy there. And so there's that gap there. That gap is closing though. I don't know if you keep an eye on job listings, sustainability job listings are just exploding right now. It's a huge growing field. There's a lot of hope that we're seeing change happening here. And not only, the reason that so many executives think this is important is because it actually has really great benefits for a business. So there's a bit of demand and drivers there. Investor pressure, consumer demand, increasing regulatory requirements that are just going to keep coming in this space, sort of that side. But also there's a lot of business benefits. Doing the work around sustainability, it helps you attract people, retain people. There's links to productivity. There's also a lot of links to efficiency, innovation, transformation, really, identifying risks and opportunities, transforming the way you work in the world, and you build a much more resilient business, a resilient value chain, sector, communities. There's a lot of advantages here, which you'll see as we kind of work through today's session, why that might be so. So that was very big picture. I want to zoom in now a little bit and talk about some of the details around carbon accounting. And remember that word accounting, it's the way that we look at carbon, the way that we sort of measure the impact you're having on the climate and the atmosphere. It is very much an accounting kind of framework. You're doing math, you're adding up numbers, we have a budget we're working within. So keep that in the back of your mind. It makes it feel a little bit more approachable sometimes. One more sort of big picture step here. So greenhouse gases, you've probably heard the phrase. Greenhouse gases are basically like a blanket that's warming the earth. There's that greenhouse effect, hence their name. There are about 7 main ones that we typically track the most, but they all behave a bit differently. So of these gases, some of them, once they're emitted, they're in the air, in the atmosphere, some of them stay there for hundreds of years. So gases like carbon dioxide, nitrous oxide. Others are more short-lived. So they go up there and they're up in the atmosphere for maybe 20, 30 years before they break down, but they can do a lot of damage in that short period of time. So glass is more like methane. But because they all act a bit differently, when we talk about carbon accounting, greenhouse gas emissions, one of the things that we do is when we're doing the math to convert your activities into a footprint, is that we convert all of those different gases into what we call carbon dioxide equivalents. So you'll hear carbon used as shorthand, basically, a carbon footprint, carbon accounting. It's because of that sort of that role of translating all of those greenhouse gases into sort of the carbon dioxide equivalent, just to give us a single common framework to talk about here. So when you hear carbon footprinting, it's actually a much more complicated system than that, but it's a useful shorthand that we all use. Got another analogy here for you. So blankets to bathtubs. Thinking about the atmosphere as a bathtub. Now you can fill up a bathtub so far before it starts to overflow, and the atmosphere has a similar sort of limited level of greenhouse gases that we can add to it before you start to see these impacts. And so in this metaphor, the greenhouse gas emissions are, the tap is on full bore, the tub is filling up really rapidly, but the drain isn't nearly as big and able to drain as quickly as the tap is on. So we're looking at possible overflowing here, and that's where the warming kicks in. So what we have to do at its core is balancing those taps, and ideally, as much as possible, turning off that tap, stopping the emissions coming in, as well as looking at how can we open up those drains. So today, the drains are largely sort of natural solutions. The carbon sinks that we find in land and ocean. So, forests that are pulling the carbon back out of the air, heat being stored in the ocean, those kinds of things. There's possibly going to be some really cool man-made solutions here, but that's still really untested. It's uncertain if it's going to happen at scale or without unintended consequences. But it's really about tightening that tap, opening up the drains. How can we do those things? At its core, that's what climate action is all about here. Got another analogy for you. So icebergs. When we talk about carbon accounting, I mentioned that it's helpful to think about it as financial accounting, right? So what sits in your books? What's your responsibility? What do you need to worry about is coming in and out of your budget? What is in somebody else's books? Where do they maybe overlap a little bit? You've gone in together on something, and you track the activities. What is your business doing? What choices is it making? And tracking those activities to understand what you've done and how you can translate those things into greenhouse gas emissions. Now, those activities, you can categorize them in a few different ways. And the reason we categorize them is to help you better understand and analyze what you've done and where you go next. The simplest way to categorize them is by the type of activity you're doing. So, are you burning fuel in a company-owned vehicle? Are you traveling on an airplane? Purchased goods and services? Those sorts of broad categories there. But the really helpful way to group them is around how much direct control do you have over where the actual emissions are happening in that activity. So at our top of our iceberg there, that's our direct emissions. These are things that your company own and or control, right? So company owned fuel in a vehicle that you own, there's a lot of direct control and influence over that. You can make choices that directly impact whether those emissions are happening, whether you're reducing the activity, the intensity. So those are your direct emissions. You'll also hear the term scope one or maybe category one, depending on which framework you're accounting under. Those are direct emissions. They're that top of the iceberg, the easiest to see and map and understand. Then as we slip below the surface of the water here, the big bulk of that iceberg, this is collectively your indirect emissions. The items that are sort of closest to the surface, what we call scope 2 emissions, category 2, these are the emissions that come from the energy that you purchase. So the grid and electricity, if you're purchasing other types of energy, maybe like in a heat transfer network. So those energy ones are scope 2, and then everything else is collectively known as scope 3, or there's some categories, category 3 through 6. There's different ways of kind of quantifying this under different frameworks, but it's largely your value chain indirect emissions. It's still part of your iceberg. It's still part of your footprint because of the choices that you've made. You've chosen to travel. Where is your facility and how do your staff or your visitors have to, use emissions potentially to travel to your facilities? What goods are you purchasing? What happens with the goods that you're selling or the services that you're selling, what emissions might have to happen for your customers to use that product. What happens at the end of life? Is there waste that goes to landfill, or is it waste that can get repurposed and put back into a cycle? And so that's your collective, your scope 3. And naturally, just like an iceberg, it's the bulk of emissions. It's also the hardest to sort of see and measure, and it's the hardest to influence and control. So that indirect stuff, really important because it's so big that we do something about it, but it can be harder. And so sort of working from your top of your iceberg down, it's about, what can you control and where do you need to be looking at things like engagement, advocacy, influence, maybe even systems change and policy change, that kind of thing, so that collectively that iceberg is changing and you have more influence across the whole thing. If we look at this from, say, a supply chain example, so a manufacturing supply chain, and you think about your core emissions, that's scope 1, maybe your scope 2, your purchase energy, in that core there at your manufacturing facility that you own and you operate. But there's also what's happening with the raw materials and how are they getting to you, maybe through some intermediaries, maybe just some freight. How are you getting them down to your customers? What happens when your customer is using that product that you've produced? Is there electricity? Is there waste? How are those resources then maybe cycled back through the system? And you can see how you might have a really good core footprint there in the middle. And then you have these hot spots where you have a good sense that actually there's something here, it's hot and it's big and we know we need to look at it, but I don't have a certain number for it. I need to do more there. And so how can I engage with that supplier? How can I make choices about which supplier I'm using so that I both start to get a better sense of what's happening in that hotspot, maybe getting a more certain number, but also shrinking it? How do we get control over that? Another way to think about it in terms that you might have heard would be your carbon footprint is that sort of that core, really kind of central piece there that you can measure it fairly clearly. And then that wider part is maybe your climate, your shadow. You might be able to map it fairly well, but it might start to blur in with someone else's shadow or a series of shadows. The edges might get a bit fuzzier and it can be a little bit harder to see and understand, but it is still your shadow kind of falling out through the system. Right, so that's giving you a bit of the crash course in terms of how you might account for emissions, how you might do some math and understand where different activities are. And then once you have those activities, you do some simple calculations using various frameworks or tools and turn those into a carbon footprint. So you've measured what that looks like. What's my impact? Maybe with more or less certainty, but you have a decent sense, a good enough sense of here's where my impacts are happening. Here's where I need to take some action next. So now I want to leave you with some technical takeaways about you have that, what do you do with it? I've been with Toitu for 10 years and I've long since lost count of the number of times I've heard the phrase, you can't manage what you don't measure. And that's because you have to measure so that you can manage. Management is really the important thing here. How do we reduce these emissions? How do we change the impact we're having on the climate? And there's some very simple ways to think about that. The work, there's still plenty of work to do. There's a lot of mahi here, but the tools, the ideas you can have about what levers might you be able to pull, there's some simple steps there to just have in the back of your mind. So one of these is the mitigation pyramid, mitigation hierarchy. The bottom of the pyramid, the absolute most important foundational element here is avoid. First and foremost, can you avoid that emission from happening? How can you avoid that altogether? The next level up, so that you can't yet avoid it for whatever reason, can you reduce it? How can you make it smaller? And those two things are the vast majority of the pyramid here. That's what we need to be focusing our energy on. That credible climate action. If somebody's talking about their climate action, that is underpinning credible, good climate performance. If you're doing something and you're doing it well, you're absolutely focusing on those things first and foremost. Then at the top, we have neutralize and compensate. So, at a certain point, you've avoided, you've reduced as much as possible, and maybe you're now working on sort of a long game, maybe an investment case or some systems change is necessary, something like that. At that point, then maybe you're looking at, can I compensate for those impacts in the meantime so that I'm not having this, sort of short-term harm? Offsets play a really important role in the transition. Sort of as we're moving forward, there's a lot to be said for offsets. They do have an important role. They are a good thing, but they are not the focus and the end game. They're not your kind of goal. The goal is to avoid the emissions. That's your foundation. The offsets are one of the tools in our toolbox, particularly as we're transitioning. But it's not about sort of measuring and offsetting. It's about measuring, really good work around avoiding and reducing, and then maybe you're looking at offsetting as one of the other options if you have some extra resource. So avoid and reduce. How do you avoid and reduce these things? And in its simplest terms, there are two levers you can pull. So the activity, can you avoid or reduce that activity from happening? Or the intensity, can you make that activity less intense for its greenhouse gas emissions? Both of those things are good levers to pull, and they work together. You can reduce the impact even faster. And sometimes you might be able to do one sort of near term, the other longer term, but they're both good tools. So on the activity level, if you're traveling, say, 5 kilometers in a fossil fuel powered vehicle, do you have to travel that 5 kilometers? Can you skip that trip? You didn't actually need to go in that trip. Can you reduce or avoid that activity? The other option is the intensity. Can you make that happening less intense? So maybe a more efficient vehicle, maybe an electric or a hybrid vehicle, something like that, where you're still traveling, there is still that activity is still happening, but it's a much less intense activity. And those two levers together will sort of shrink it down from this large impact to a much smaller impact. And that's really what this is all about. I make it sound really simple. We do know that there's a lot of hard work to be done here. These things aren't always easier. They can take time, or investment cases. They can take a lot of collaboration. But in one hand, it is as simple as this. Can you reduce or avoid the activity? Can you make it less intense? What are your options there? How can you think differently about what you're doing? Whether you need to be doing it? Can you make it more efficient? And I mentioned this is good for business because often the things that are causing emissions are also costing money. Is this a chance to innovate? Is this a chance to partner and transform your business? Is this a risk in your supply chain? And can you avoid that so that you can be more resilient? Is it worth doing maybe a business case, an investment, maybe some CapEx funding or something like that to have a different, more resilient emission source? Do you need a coal boiler? What are the other ways that you could get the same result for your business in a much more future-proofed way? Now you thinking about these things, you're working on this stuff, and you want to be a leader. You want to start showing some leadership here. Leadership, when it comes to climate performance, can be signified by the 3 A's: ambition, action, and advocacy. So what is your ambition? Your ambition should absolutely be aligned with that climate science, but how else? Where are you being really ambitious, and how can you kind of help push that ambitious action outward? the action that you're taking in line with that ambition. What action are you doing? And advocacy. How are you helping it go outside of your own company's borders? So, stepping out from your company to your value chain, out to your sector, out to wider society. How can you be helping at all of those places? Because with this space, when you think about that 1.5-degree pathway, we're racing to zero. The goal here is that we're racing to having sort of net zero emissions. But that race, it's a special kind of race. That race it doesn't matter who's first. It doesn't matter who the first half are. It actually only matters when everyone has hit that mark. The race can only be won when the last one has crossed that finish line, right? And so as a leader, or an aspiring leader in this space, it's thinking about how can you be working outside of your operations as well. So you take those ambitious steps to decarbonize your own operations. You're working within your sector and your value chain for how change can happen there. How can you work together, build a much more resilient sector, a more resilient value chain? And then what can you do beyond that in your society? Could you advocate for policy, for regulation? Can you work with your community and kind of help pay it forward and help them transition? What are the things that you can do so that you're helping not only bring yourself racing towards that zero, but you're helping bring others along with you? Now, climate performance. So you know that climate action is something that we need to do. You have a decent sense of, the basics of carbon accounting and what you might want to do there, and that you need to do something about it. You've measured it, and now you need to manage it. And those things collectively kind of create this umbrella of climate performance. Credible climate action, climate performance, these are phrases that you'll hear. And how do you know that you're doing it well? That this is what good climate performance looks like? Or if you're seeing a claim out in the marketplace, how do you know that they're doing good? Is this good climate performance? Should I trust this? Or is it are they carbon washing, which is sort of the new greenwashing, right? Are they just pulling the wool over my eyes and making themselves look better with some fancy pledges? How do you know you can trust climate performance? How do you know what good looks like? And the best and the easiest answer is that you go to experts. We at Toy2, this is what we are all about. We are all about credible climate action and helping others understand this is what good looks like, do these things, and having that verified third-party assurance that you're doing it accurately, completely in line with science, in line with lead practice. We've been doing this for 21 years, taking the science, taking international frameworks, policies, 21 years of working with businesses and understanding their needs and their challenges. And we translate that into our carbon programs. And those carbon programs include tools and our expert people, independent auditors, guidance, advice, and our sort of Toy2 collective communities that support our customers, organizations, and products and services to take action and do so credibly. So these are some claims that you might have seen in the marketplace, maybe on someone's business card or their email signature, maybe on a product packaging. Toy2 Carbon Reduce, that you can trust that claim, whoever's making that claim, they are measuring their emissions, they're quantifying that greenhouse gas emissions into their footprint, they're managing them, they have plans in place, and they're actively reducing those, and it's verified. It's a third-party endorsement that you have done this accurately, completely against these good practice frameworks. If you're seeing net carbon zero, Toy2 net carbon zero, they're doing that same really good work of they're measuring, they're avoiding and reducing first and foremost. They've been verified that yes, you've got this, you've got it accurate and complete. And they are taking that extra step of offsetting. What can we do to kind of compensate for these things in the meantime? How can we help fund our future and create a little bit of, buy some time and create a neutral impact? Net carbon zero, just like in accounting, it's a net zero balance. You have your sort of gross total and you're balancing that out to a neutral zero position. Toy2 Climate Positive is our newest program, so you might have seen this one out there. Same thing, you're measuring, you're avoiding and reducing first and foremost in line with climate science, that 1.5-degree pathway. It's verified. you're offsetting beyond neutrality. So, you have your gross balance, you've offset that not only to zero, but kind of a bit beyond that, and positively contributing to wider society. So thinking about that leadership, that advocacy space, and going outside of your own boundaries. So positive, we can verify that you're doing good work to help your communities, your sector, your wider society transition as well. You're helping bring others with you on that race to net zero. So your carbon journey, right? You might sign up for one of our frameworks, you might be trying a few other things, but what might your carbon journey look like? You go off in the next few years, what might this look like? How do you translate all of this sort of science and accounting into something that feels a little bit more practical? So these steps, and they may not happen quite in this order, but your carbon journey might look something like you start off measuring and managing those organizational emissions, that your scope ones and your scope twos, those more direct end of things, but also some of your scope threes, kind of your business travel, your freight that you're paying for, that kind of thing. You get a bit of a handle on that, and maybe you're like, right, I've got this. Let's set a science-aligned target. We're going to agree to reduce our emissions in line with that 1.5 degree trajectory. We're going to bend our curve as sharp as possible, cut them in half by 2030, 95% by 2050, and mapping out a bit of a pathway of how might we do that? How might we bend our curve? What are the things we need to be thinking about now, and the things that we're going to think about in 10, 20 years, so that we're that really resilient, future ready company. And that would include looking sort of up and down your value chain, engaging with those suppliers so that they're taking action, but also thinking about how are you a good supplier? So in your value chain, what can you do to model good to your customers, to your partners? Maybe looking at your own service and measuring and managing that full life cycle impact, that full upstream, downstream impact, managing that, maybe even offsetting it so that your customers know, I don't have to worry about this part of my climate shadow. I don't have to worry about this, indirect emission, because I can trust that it's under control. They're looking after this, and they've even neutralized it for me. So they've got that. I can focus my work on other projects. And then, yeah, over time, you're looking at that advocacy, that ambition, that action, maybe looking at you've avoided and reduced, you're working on advocacy for some systems change, and you're going to maybe step up to a net carbon zero or a climate positive position while you're working on some more of that work, and you get endorsed as a leader. So next steps, that's a journey that probably feels a bit daunting in some ways if you're quite new to this space. That's might feel 5 years away, 7 years away. And we're, as humans, it's really hard for our brains to think about, 7 years away, that's ages. What do I do right now? So I want to give you some next steps, some things that you can practically take and go away and do, this week, this month, in the next couple months, so that you feel like you're able to start taking some steps here, because it's just one step at a time and you just keep going. And I'll also indicate some resources that we have for you, and then we'll open it up for some questions. So those are next steps. What might some of your next practical steps be? Be accountable, and hold your company, hold your supply chain, hold your partners all to account as well. And accountable can look like a lot of different things. It can look like public commitments, and then sort of having assurance over that. So here's my commitment. Here's a verified, inventory of my achievements so far and how that's changing over time. Showing what you're doing to manage and that you're able to track that. Working with your supply chain, avoiding and reduce. If nothing else, remembering that sort of avoiding and reduce is your first major project. That's where you want to put your resources. Offsetting has a role to play, but first and foremost, direct your resources to how you can avoid and reduce those emissions. Collaborate, ask for help, both within your company. Ask different departments, ask upward, ask outward, ask out to sector partners or customers or communities. How can we do this together? How can we win this race together and create some change, build some resilience? Share what you've learned, and that means what didn't go well as well as what did go well. We can all learn from each other here, and often you learn the most from, you tried something and it didn't do what you expected it to do, and that can be really helpful for someone else, that they don't have to make that same mistake. And definitely be transparent, publicly report your progress. If you're making these big commitments and then you're not kind of being honest and open about what you're doing and where you are, and that maybe you're quite early in this journey, that's when the scrutiny starts to hit. But if you're open and you're honest and you're transparent about this, everyone in general tends to be quite open and receptive to that and trustworthy of that. They can see that you're on this journey and where you're going. I might challenge you to sort of grab a team, grab your department, grab some people from different departments, and maybe sit down and with a cuppa and ask yourselves some of these questions. Sit down with your cuppa after this and think about some of these questions. How climate competent are your teams? Is this a space that you need to build into professional development plans? What are the skills that maybe your people across your organization might need here, so that you can be making climate conscious decisions at all levels of the business? Strategic questions, short-term costs, longer-term decarbonization, as well as things like the cost of inaction or investment costs, life cycle costs. Looking at these things, what's the most strategic way to be making some of these decisions across your business so that climate is part of that decision-making process? Does your legacy include climate action? Do you want it to? And what might that look like? How does that fit into your role? How does that fit into your career pathway? The career pathway of the people that you're mentoring, or depending on where you are in your career. What does your legacy include? And if it doesn't include much yet, how could you maybe start building some of that in? What area do you want to learn about? I've got some resources for those of you that are curious about stuff just to get started. And if none of those resources are tapping into it, just ask us. We love sharing our expertise. Is there, where can you learn about some of these things that you want to learn about? And even one of the harder questions, which it can be quite fun for a bit of a lunchtime innovation workshop. What's more important? What are the trade-offs? What are the pros and cons around minimizing the impacts of climate on your business? Sort of, what are you going to have to adapt to? How can you minimize those adaptations? Mitigating the actual impact you're having, and where are the trade-offs there? Where are the pros and cons? Where do you need to make some choices? It can be a really interesting experiment to kind of think about those things and how they might inform the decisions you're making now and the sort of the business plans that you're making for the next 5, 10, 20 years. These are some of the resources that we'll share with you afterwards. So you'll have these, you can dive in. Those first links, if you were intrigued or confused by any of the climate science that I started off with, these are some really great, very accessible resources to kind of dive deeper in that. That first one really helps you understand who is the IPCC, why do we care, what are they telling us? It's basically an infographic that takes 750,000 words of science and makes it really accessible. What does 3 degrees look like? Why do we care about those half a degree? Some really good things to help it feel like, so that you can see what the impacts are and how real they're actually already happening, or how you and your lifetime, your children, how these impacts will be felt. The middle links there, simulate our future. So these are essentially games that you can play and get a better sense and a better feel for what this, what the stakes are. What does it take to save our planet? The En-ROADS one is one that we all really loved here at Toy2, but I will say it's maybe a little bit on the nerdier side. If you really like sort of scenario planning and data and analytics, you might really like this one. It's a really great tool, and it's really fun to sort of see whether what you think will have the most change will actually have the most change. We did it recently. We were all a bit surprised by actually which was the #1 thing that could have the greatest impact quickest. The climate game, on the other hand, this is from the Financial Times. It's really fun. You pick a character and you go through this. It's a really accessible game, and it helps just create a little bit of that sort of climate awareness across your company. Highly recommend that you share this with your teams. And remember, we're here, Toy2. What we love most above all is sharing our expertise that we have, our business expertise, our environmental expertise. It's what we love to do. So I've got a few links there. As well as, subscribe to our newsletter, follow us on social, reach out to us, ask us questions. We would love to share more of our knowledge. And on that note, I would love to open it up to questions if you have any. Please use the chat or the Q&A box, and we will answer these. And if we do run out of any questions, run out of time and we can't get to your questions, we'll make sure that we address those afterwards. Um, I can see we did answer in the chat one about sort of what step on the chart do you need to be in order to claim carbon reduce. And so I'll pull back up my climate journey here. When you're looking at this journey, to be carbon reduced, sort of starting out, it starts out as a bit of a commitment and it morphs into a sort of a rolling achievement and commitment. So you can start off, you can sign up for our certification program. You do the work around measuring and making plans and going through the audit, and you can get the certification at that point and start claiming that and making claims. But then it's a rolling thing. There's an annual process where you're going through and checking in, okay, here's our footprint this year, here's the changes we've made, here's what did or did not work, here's what we're going to do about it next year. And it's a rolling thing. With climate performance, there's always that balance between achievements, what have you done so far, and commitments, where are you aiming, what is your ambition level, and where are you going. And there, whenever you're seeing any of these claims out there, whether it's ours or someone else's, it's that balance there between where are you so far, how mature are you on this journey. And so really, if you wanted to be a carbon reduced certified organization, it is as simple as sort of measuring and managing those organizational emissions to start off with, and then that will grow over time. And the other steps on this journey are things that you might look at as you mature. You know, maybe you've achieved some of those great avoidance and reduction wins, and then you're kind of growing your emissions sort of savvy from there. A question on, while setting reduction targets, which is the best way to set the plan? Absolute reduction emission, reductions based on intensity, combination of 1 and 2, why? Really good question. So when you're looking at your reductions, you've got your measurement, you're making your plans here. Is it about focusing on, you know, shrinking this number of 100 down to 0? Is it about taking that number of 100, you know, tons of greenhouse gases and, you know, putting it in the context of your, say, your revenue is a really common intensity metric, or your full-time equivalent, the size of your organization. So looking at it that way, is that the right way to do it? Is it some combination therein? So the official, like, ideal state is that absolute emission reduction is what we need, very much so, for the climate. We absolutely have to truly reduce that number, that 100 tons, to 0. But the intensity, economic intensity or other intensity metrics, they can be a useful thing. They can be really helpful as you're tracking things. If you're in a growth phase and you're trying to map out, you know, how do you decouple growth and emissions? If you're trying to understand the size of your company, things like that. We very much look to the Science Based Target Initiative as one of our sort of guiding lights of what good science-aligned reductions look like. And they have pathways as well. So, you know, what are the pathways for your absolute reductions? Maybe what does good look like for your sector in certain sectors? And then what about economic intensity? But in all of those, they do all come back to, at their core, absolute emission reduction. So intensity has a role to play, and it can be a useful way of tracking and monitoring some things, but it's number one, absolute emission reduction is our real target. Okay, we've got a question about the carbon neutral government program and knowing what percentage of emissions is created by all government agencies' operations in relation to the west of New Zealand. That is a really good question, and I don't know the answer, but I bet we could figure it out at least roughly. So we'll make a note to come back to you on that one. When we send this out, we'll make a note of that's one that we want to report back onto you. There will be some information there, but I don't know it off the top of my head. We've got a question. What impact do you think the upcoming TCFD rollout is going to have on New Zealand businesses? Do you think that other frameworks like GRI will fade as companies focus on those TCFD specific frameworks? Right, so TCFD, Task Force for Climate Financial Related Disclosures, I think is the official acronym there. It's basically a disclosure kind of framework, a mandatory disclosure for what the climate impact on, and particularly with that sort of a financial lens on it. So for example, if you're maybe a bank and you have your loans or your investments, what are when you think about that value chain in your climate shadow, what does your climate shadow look like for the things that you're investing in or the money you're loaning in? Can you make that a greener shadow? You know, are you investing in maybe a fossil fuel company, but that investment is specifically about how they transform and away from fossil fuels, things like that. So the task force, the TCFD framework, and the work that's coming out of the New Zealand government, the XRB, they're developing a New Zealand specific standard here on what certain entities will have to disclose around their carbon footprint. It's likely that that regulation will kind of expand out from that first group of entities. So I think in terms of impact on New Zealand businesses, I think it's going to be a really great, powerful way of kind of pushing for more disclosure and more action, more people stepping up. And I think we'll start to see climate reporting and climate disclosure become a lot more mainstream a lot quicker. It's really good. I think it's the fact that we're going to have more of that information will mean that it's going to be a lot easier to make decisions about, what you're doing, who you're investing in, who you're purchasing from, around those things. So in that sense, I think it's going to be really good. I think it's also very likely that that regulation will expand out to cover a lot more businesses down the track. And so it might help, kind of push some of those earlier adopters into doing it voluntarily before it might, in the future, might become regulation. I think it'll also help a lot with that sort of collaboration. Some of the work that we're doing with financial institutes currently, it is about kind of how can they use their business for good. And I think we'll see maybe a lot more of that, of kind of actually thinking about climate choices with your business. What are you doing? How can you influence and advocate? The rise of sustainable linked loans, and that you can get a preferred interest rate by sort of being able to prove that you're making certain progress depending on what your loan is for. Things like that are going to sort of really create this ecosystem of everyone doing this really collaboratively and sort of all of us aiming for that same goal. In terms of the second part of that question around other frameworks like GRI, other frameworks will fade. I feel like my gut says yes. I think other frameworks will fade. I don't think it's going to be a quick thing. We're still in that space in climate performance where there are a lot of frameworks coming out. You're seeing a lot of disagreement about what this should look like. I do think they will kind of eventually come together where we will have a consensus on this is what good will look like. But I think we're probably a few years away for that to be true, which means, unfortunately, for some of our export companies or companies that sort of play at the global level, you might have to deal with a few different frameworks in the near term. But again, working with a good expert partner who's used to dealing with some of those different frameworks and reporting requirements can help take some of that pain away. Let's see here. Does Toy2 provide clients with suggestions of suppliers that are aligned with their carbon reduction journey? So for Toy2 specifically, we do in some cases. It depends a little bit. We do work to maintain a bit of impartiality and independence there. We don't necessarily, even with our customers, we give them a lot of tools and resources and guidance, but we wouldn't go through and say, you should do this precisely, because then we can't really audit that because we've done that work for them. So we do have a degree of independence, but we do, for our customers, sort of collectively, we have a lot of resources there around, look at these suppliers. Here are some tools and things to do to kind of engage with your suppliers. We give them a lot of that kind of stuff. We also actively encourage work across our client base. And so how can we help the sort of the Toy2 collective, we refer to our little family, and, how can they work from and purchase from one another? We ourselves do that as well. It's really, the focus is more about engagement, because the way we like to see it is, rather than it being about you have to work with somebody who's already doing good, but how can you get the suppliers you already have and that you've built relationships with, how can you get them on this journey as well? We're early enough in the phase that we want to bring everyone along, whether they're working with us or not. So it's definitely about engaging with your suppliers, asking them these questions. What are you doing? Do you have a measurement? Can you share that with me? That's probably the key thing I would say with supply chain at the moment. Next question. Do you have any recommendations of podcasts or websites to follow to keep up with the changing happening in the sustainability space? Another really good question. I think we can pull a few things together and add those to the resources that we'll send out for you. I personally, I follow quite a few people on LinkedIn that I like to kind of keep an eye on what they're doing. I have a few of my favorite newsletters that I follow. We've got some articles on our website that sort of round up a few good ideas on podcasts and websites as well, but we'll round some of those resources up for you. Let's see here. How does this align with ISO 14001? Right. So ISO, for those of you who aren't familiar, they're an independent standards organization. They're the ones that kind of, they get together and they create these consensus standards of this is what, good should look like for a certain thing. ISO 14001 specifically is the standard that looks at what a good environmental management system should look like. And an environmental management system sort of takes your environmental aspects and impacts. What are the ways that you are or could potentially touch the environment or have potential issues there, and building out a system to management, just like a quality management system, but a management system dedicated to focus on that. So that's what 14001 does. We actually have another program, our Environment program, which is aligned with that. And it's sort of a tiered progress program that mentors you through building and creating an environmental management system that takes you to be fully aligned with 14001. But there's different ISO standards that look at carbon accounting and climate. There's a whole bunch of climate standards. The one we, for our customers, when we provide an audit, we audit them against one of the ISO standards. So for an organization, it's 14064 Part 1. We use 14064 Part 3 to govern how we audit, what good auditing actually looks like. For a product or a service footprint, we use a British standard, PAS 2050, as well as a fairly recent standard, ISO 14067. There's also a lot of other standards that sort of govern the way we as a certifier operate, that we're accredited against, the way that we would govern a program. There's standards around like what good carbon claims look like. There's a new standard that we're watching very closely that's going to sort of say this is what carbon neutral should look like. So that one hopefully is out by the end of the year. So there's a whole bunch of ISO standards. ISO is one of our guiding lights as well in terms of what should good look like. In most cases, we go well beyond ISO because it's a consensus standard, and they can move a bit slower. They're not always fully up with the times, but they are a really useful framework, and it's really helpful for consensus and kind of comparing apples with apples. If you have two companies who do very different things, but they both have an ISO certified inventory, it's a little bit easier to know that you can compare those two with one another. Let's see here. Just as a note, kind of going back, the TCFD, so the climate financial disclosures in New Zealand, to start with, those climate related disclosures are going to be mandatory specifically for large listed companies with a market capitalization of more than 60 million, large licensed insurers, registered banks, credit unions, building societies, and managers of investment schemes with more than 1 billion in assets, and some of the Crown financial institutions. So there's, it's a really big group, and those collectively are known as I think it's climate reporting entities. So it's a fairly specific group that are going to have to do this as a mandatory framework to start with. But the sense is that this is sort of, it will kind of expand out from there. Let's see here. Just checking on other questions. Remember, please use the chat or the Q&A box if you have any other questions. We will make sure we send you these, the recording, the slides, and the resources I've mentioned, and a few extra resources based on your questions. We'll get those out to you as well, so that you can tap back into these or share them with anyone else. Make sure that you feel free to ask us additional questions if something comes up later. When it comes to your scope 3s, so that wider indirect emissions, your value chain emissions, this is a really growing space sort of globally. This is where a lot of everyone's attention is going. One of the stats there is around the fact that often your scope 3s, so that wider value chain impact, is on average, it's at least 11 times bigger than your core footprint. So there's that climate shadow is really big, really important to address and to deal with. And there are various moves kind of signaling and guiding us in terms of what and how do we do this. It can be hard. There's a lot of work around engagement. How do you share data with secure, sort of looking after privacy, those kinds of things. How do you attribute what share is your fair share, some of that kind of work. So there's a lot of really cool stuff happening in that space. One of the potential things to note is that under the TCFD, so under that pending framework that New Zealand's going to start enforcing for next year, those entities will need to know their supplier emissions. So it's that kind of increasingly, it's going to become mandatory to be looking at that scope 3. Scope 3 sort of mandatory. It's I think it's worth noting that that is expected by all of us, that's very much a continual improvement journey. So you might start off with kind of that rough screening, that hotspot. It's maybe not an exact number that everyone has a lot of certainty about, but you've got a justifiable way of kind of how you got to your assessment of how big that hotspot is. You can kind of show and explain and defend how you've mapped that out. And then it's all about continual improvement. So how are you engaging with those suppliers? How are you working together? How are you working with other partners or services to kind of help map those things with increasing better precision? It's a space that we're really actively looking at. A lot of other companies are looking at as well. And we're all expecting that that's going to get a lot easier and clearer over the next few years as more of us are kind of in that space and we figure out some good wins and we build some good tools and get better emissions factors. So an emission factor is kind of, it's really important. It's how we do the math. It's how we convert, an activity into a greenhouse gas. It's that kind of bit in the middle of that equation. And so, you've driven this far, you've burned this much fuel, you've flown this far, and you use an emission factor to kind of convert that into your emissions total. And there's a lot of cool work happening with our, my beloved sort of emission factor people on our company around, what are the best emission factors? What are better ones that we can use? What is that range there of, what does it look like getting started out and how do you kind of improve what you're doing there? Let's see here, another question. For someone looking to transition into this industry, could you recommend a course or a way to get your foot in the door? This is a good question, and it's one that I've been asked before. I was lucky enough to kind of stumble accidentally into this space 10 years ago. And I am so delighted that I've found my way here, but it's definitely a growing field. I think that there's a lot of open doors and opportunities that there didn't used to be. So there's a lot of hope there. I would probably suggest looking at, in terms of courses, I can't think of any off the top of my head, depending on whether there might be certain things, like if you're particularly keen on auditing, there's some courses there. There's some professional bodies. CEP does some really good training courses there. Carbon Environmental Professionals, I think CEP. So in terms of training there's some good stuff there, but the other, job hunting, it's all about networking. And so maybe tap into the Sustainable Business Network or the Sustainable Business Council, subscribe to those newsletters. There's often job listings there. Start meeting with people, going to events in your region, talking to people, but also look at whether you can do that in your own job. In a lot of ways, as we're maturing in sustainability, we're starting to see that sustainability is everyone's role. And so there might be some really cool work you can do around, what can you influence already in your current job? Could you join a green team? Could you do some professional development there? Is there some way of building it in and kind of building up some of that experience on the ground as well? I find that can be really helpful. And I sit on our Toitu's internal green team, and it's I really love the things that I've been able to learn and experiment with in that space as well, or looking after our B Corp certification, those kinds of things. There's so much you can learn and apply. Just kind of, get your hands stuck in. We are just about at time. So thank you so much for your attention and your energy today. I really appreciate it. We'll get you out these resources. If anything else occurs to you, please flick your questions to us. We're always happy to answer them. Find us on social, on our website, subscribe to our newsletter. We'd love to hear from you. We'd love to share more knowledge, and let us know what webinar you want us to run next. And we'd be happy to keep sharing our knowledge with you. Thank you so much, everyone. Really appreciate you today. Have a wonderful rest of your day.